Being a positive kind of guy, let me start with the good news. A 90-minute phone call between President Trump and President Putin today has set the path to a visit to Moscow by President Trump and a visit to Washington by President Putin. These words would have been impossible to imagine if Kamala Harris had, God forbid, won the US presidential election back in November. Hegseth's statements today that there would never be any American forces in Ukraine, either in the war or in any peacekeeping mode after the conclusion of hostilities, was a virtual political death sentence for little Zelensky. He now knows that his allies have abandoned him. Not the Lilliputian ones, not Penny Mordaunt, the fighting Boudica of Tory politics. Although she's no longer in Parliament, she's on the speaking circuit and still got her supper to sing for. Not the, what's his name, little John Healey, the most unconvincing war leader in British military history. No, the Lilliputians are still right behind Zelensky. The yapping doglets of the so-called Baltic republics, they're ready to fight to the last Ukrainian and to cut off their nose to spite their face in order to do it. All three of them unplugged from the Russian grid this week, and within 48 hours, the electricity bills payable by the consumers doubled in 48 hours and may well double again in the next 48 hours. They are all still right behind Zelensky, but as they are quickly about to learn, without the United States, there is NATO. We've been telling you this for decades, that NATO is merely the lipstick on the pig of American imperial power. Without America, there is no NATO. You can put a Norwegian tailor, Stoltenberg or whatever his name was, in charge of an organization and call it multinational. You can even pick up the odd Dutch rent boy like Rutte and pretend that he is a great war leader, but none of them add up to a row of beans. Without the United States, there is no NATO. And therefore, going around the world threatening people with America's army is not going to cut it any longer. The basis of a deal will still have to be worked out, but the willingness of both the Russians and the United States to reach a deal speaks volumes. 90 minutes is a very long telephone call. There is nobody in my life, except my wife maybe, and only maybe, that I would speak to on the phone for 90 minutes. But that's what the two men did today from the White House and the Kremlin. And if they don't hurry up, then Russia's battlefield advances will continue to make new facts accomplished on the ground. And that might well still be the case. If the whole thing grinds slowly, then the Russian army's advance will grind rather less slowly. The hallelujahs can be heard coming from the poor, suffering people of Ukraine, dragged into this war as a proxy for the Biden administration and the Obama administration before that, dragged into this conflict for the enrichment of arms companies and politicians in the United States and in Ukraine and in other parts of Europe, no doubt. Expendable, 1 million of them, their life's blood on the frozen steppe of the Ukraine. Great hallelujahs may obviously be heard in Russia, which has paid a very high price in blood and treasure to reach this point. And though the churlishness will churn in Fleet Street and on the American-sponsored BBC, it is inherently a good thing that the war is coming to an end, and with it, the myriad of sanctions that accompanied it. It may be some time before, again, the British and some others catch up with that. But if Russia and America are doing booming business between them, the Europeans will merely be cutting off their own nose to spite their own face to stand against that tide. That's the good news. I'm afraid the bad news almost equals it. The bad news is that from Saturday afternoon, it would appear that all-out war in the Middle East is a racing certainty. This has been caused by the deliberate wrecking of the ceasefire agreed by 4 countries and sponsored by the United States, the deliberate sabotage of the agreement to exchange prisoners, of the agreement to allow meaningful aid, tents, medicine, food, water, on an agreed timetable in agreed quantities, has been deliberately wrecked by Netanyahu. He, nobody else, has destroyed the ceasefire. He got some hostages out. He was forced to release some more Palestinian prisoners, and otherwise known as hostages. They're either both prisoners or they're both hostages. You can't have one and not the other. But the lives of those that remain there in captivity in Gaza have been deemed, 77 lives have been deemed completely expendable by Netanyahu for his own nakedly personal and party political purposes. So war is back. Starvation is back. And the United States now must take full responsibility for it. In the first time in the long and tortured history of America's relations with the Arab world, we have an American president who has effectively joined the war against the beleaguered Palestinian people. He has declared an American occupation of the internationally recognized Palestinian territory of Gaza, and he's given a green light to Netanyahu to annex the West Bank, a precursor, no doubt, for the driving of the Palestinians in the West Bank over the River Jordan into the Hashemite kingdom, about which more in a minute. It started out as something that you might take as Donald Trump having had too many Coca-Colas. It started out as if he was running off at the mouth in the presence of Benjamin Netanyahu, whose butler he was acting as throughout the latter's visit to the White House. But he's doubled down and doubled down and doubled down. The reason to believe that it might just be some kind of brainstorm that was going on in Donald Trump's mind was that he said he was going to buy the Gaza Strip. I presume because he doesn't like to pay for things with his own money if other people's money can be deployed, he meant that the United States was going to buy the Gaza Strip. But as I pointed out here on Wednesday, buy from whom? The Gaza Strip is owned by the Palestinian people who live there and overwhelmingly were born there. It's their land and they don't want to sell. So how are you going to buy a Gaza Strip where the owners have no intention of selling? Maybe he'd been misadvised. Maybe he thought that Gaza was owned by Israel. But of course it is not, and never has been, never will be. And so he changed his tack 2 days later, he explicitly said in the presence of an Arab king that he was now not going to buy Gaza. He was merely going to take it. Take it with what army, President Trump? With Netanyahu's army? How did that go over the last 16 months? Ask the families of the more than 10,000 Israeli soldiers killed and wounded in the Gaza Strip in the last 16 months. Whose army is going to deliver the Gaza Strip to you as the new self-proclaimed owner? It could only be an American army. I've just watched a 3-part documentary on Netflix. I commend it to you, President Trump. It's called Surviving Black Hawk Down, although there are actually 3 Black Hawks down in Mogadishu in 1993. The American fighters, Rangers, Delta Force soldiers, crack fighters, ask them how it went in a rambling shanty town called Mogadishu, and then ponder, scale it up, what that would be like in the rubble of Gaza. You don't have enough good soldiers to take control of Gaza. And if you did, the war of attrition, the resistance of the Palestinian fighters against American occupiers would bleed your army for years, long after you've left the White House. How long do you think the American public would put up with that? This is madness, President Trump. You're not going to buy the Gaza. You're not going to take the Gaza. You're not going to occupy the Gaza. The Gaza will never be a Trump Tower and assorted condominiums, casinos, and all the rest of the Florida paraphernalia. None of these things will ever happen. And they won't happen for another reason also. Nobody is going to take 2.3 million Palestinians. Nobody. Not Britain, where Keir Starmer, today, the Labour Prime Minister, declared that he was going to close the legal loophole through which 6 sick Gazans with family members resident here in Britain had been allowed by a judge to enter. A Labour Prime Minister is going to close the loophole for sick Gazans, 6 of them, having of course supported the entry into the United Kingdom of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. I wonder what the difference was. By the way, if you're still in the Labour Party, after what Keir Starmer has just announced, you're a human rat. You're not any kind of socialist, social democrat. You're not even human. Anybody still in the Labour Party after Starmer's announcement today is a human rat. But back to the bigger picture. Hampshire won't be taking them. New Hampshire won't be taking them. Egypt won't be taking them. In fact, the Egyptian president, Sisi, has just announced that he will not go into any talks with President Trump where the forcible resettlement, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in Gaza is even on the agenda. So forget that. And that brings me to the Hashemite. I've seen many pitiful, pitiable scenes in my life. I've seen abject humiliation. I've seen the look of being on the verge of a nervous breakdown many times in my long life. But I've never seen anything so pitiful as a so-called Arab king, all 4'11" of them, sitting there next to Donald Trump in the White House at a press conference this week. King Abdullah will never recover from the shame of those moments where he had to listen. He chose to listen to Donald Trump boasting of how he was now the owner of Gaza, that he was going to remove 2.3 million Palestinians from it, and that he would not let them return. I don't know if you saw King Abdullah's eyes, his trembling lips. I don't know if you saw the tick that he seemed instantly, immediately to have developed. I won't try and mimic it because I don't like to mock the afflicted. But I was ashamed for him. Black, burning shame to the roots of the hair. That is what must have been the experience of the Hashemite king of Jordan, whose grandfather was appointed by the British to be the king of Saudi Arabia. Only King Saud ibn Saud drove him out, and he had to settle for Jordan as a consolation prize. I don't think he can possibly survive this unless, having put his anus back into his body, unless having found some kind of pair of balls, unless having recovered his bottle, he now tells Donald Trump that what he blinked was one of these blink 3 times if you need rescued situations. That having recovered his bottle, he was telling Donald Trump to get stuffed, and that he stands 4 square with General Sisi and the rest of the Arab world, including the aforementioned Saudi Arabia, and says, this is a red line for us, you know. We're not going to be pushed around anymore. We're not going to be humiliated anymore. We have other friends too, and those friends are becoming more and more significant, as the ending of the Ukraine war will very definitely establish. We'll be talking to the great Gerald Celente in New York and the one and only Scott Ritter in the course of this, the mother of all talk shows. Stay tuned.